Have you ever carried a question your whole life, one that whispers in quiet moments and screams in your silence? At 85 years old, Harold had lived through wars, heartbreak, and the death of 2 wives. But there was one thing he never dared to touch: the mystery of his birth. With trembling hands and a heart full of doubt, he swabbed his cheek for a DNA test, not knowing it would uncover a truth so powerful. It would leave his entire family in tears. This isn't just a story about DNA. It's about identity, legacy, and a love lost and found after a lifetime. Harold Bennett had always been a quiet man. A retired librarian from a small town in upstate New York, he spent his days tending to his rose garden, drinking tea by the window, and listening to classical records that skipped in the same spots every time. He had the face of someone who had seen too much and spoken too little. His children used to joke that he was born with a book in one hand and a secret in the other. But the truth was, Harold had always felt like a page was missing from the book of his life. His earliest memories were fragmented. Faces with no names, a cold metal crib, nurses in white uniforms. He had been adopted in 1943 during the chaos of World War II and told that his biological parents had died in an accident. That's all. No names, no photos, no explanations. Just silence. And Harold, raised by kind but distant adoptive parents, learned quickly not to ask questions that made others uncomfortable. As the years passed, he buried the ache. He focused on school, fell in love with poetry, married young, and had children of his own. But at night, when the house was still and everyone else was asleep, Harold would sometimes press a hand to his chest and wonder, where do I really come from? Whose hands do I have? Whose voice echoes in mine? The longing never left. It only grew quieter. After his second wife passed away, Harold found himself alone in a house too big for one person. The photos on the walls stared back at him like ghosts. His children, now grown and moved away. His wives, both lost to illness. It was in this solitude, surrounded by memories and half-answers, that the ache began to rise again. One Sunday afternoon, his granddaughter Emma came to visit. She was 27, sharp-witted, and studying genetic counseling. Over tea and ginger biscuits, she mentioned that she had taken a DNA test recently and discovered that her roots stretched far beyond what the family had believed. "You should try it, Grandpa," she said, pulling out her phone. "It might tell you something amazing. You've always said you didn't know much about where you came from." Harold gave a tight smile, the kind that barely moved his lips. "Maybe some questions aren't meant to be answered," he said. But Emma didn't let it go. The next week, a small box arrived in the mail, 23andMe. Harold stared at it on his kitchen table for 3 days before opening it. His hands trembled as he swabbed the inside of his cheek. There was a voice inside him saying, "What are you doing? It's too late." But another voice whispered louder, "Maybe it's not." He sealed the envelope, dropped it in the mailbox, and tried to forget it. But something had shifted. For the first time in 85 years, Harold allowed himself to hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the end of a story, but the beginning of another. Harold had almost convinced himself the test wouldn't matter, that it would come back inconclusive, a blurry map of ancestry with no real answers. But one morning, just as the robins outside began their song and the kettle whistled on the stove, Emma called. "Grandpa, your results came in." Her voice was strange, excited, but also quiet, like someone trying to hold back something too big for words. Harold sat down slowly, his knees cracking as he lowered himself into the chair by the window. "Go on then," he said, clutching the phone to his ear. Emma took a deep breath. "You're not who we thought you were." Harold's stomach turned. "What do you mean?" There's There's a match, a very close match. It says you have a sibling, a full sibling, still alive. His name is Walter Sinclair. He lives in Oregon, and he's 87 years old. The room spun. A full sibling. Harold blinked hard, as if the words themselves were too big to process. 85 years of living, of searching, longing, wondering, and now this, a brother? Not just a cousin, not a vague ancestral line, but someone made of the same blood, someone who had been out there all this time. "I don't understand," he whispered. "They said my parents died. I was alone, always alone." Emma spoke gently. "Grandpa, I think there's more to the story than anyone ever told you." The days that followed were a whirlwind. Emma helped Harold navigate the website, showing him the family tree that bloomed before his eyes. Names he had never seen, places he'd never known he had connections to. Yorkshire, Toronto, even rural Georgia. But nothing mattered more than that one name, Walter Sinclair. According to the test, Walter was a 99.9% match, a full biological brother. Harold stared at the little circle on the screen that said "Sibling Match" in bold green letters. His hand shook as he clicked on Walter's profile. There was a small photo of an older man in a fishing vest, standing by a lake, holding a trout with a proud grin. His face was eerily familiar, the same blue eyes, the same furrow in the brow, even the same ears. Harold couldn't breathe. How is this possible?" he asked Emma. She had been digging, and what she found was shocking. Back in the 1930s and 40s, it wasn't uncommon for struggling families to place children in orphanages temporarily, especially during the Great Depression. Harold and Walter had been born just 2 years apart, sons of a young British-American couple who had lost everything in the war. When tragedy struck, a fire that destroyed their home, the children were separated and placed in state care. Records were spotty. Somewhere along the way, Harold was marked as an orphan, adopted out, forgotten. But Walter hadn't been. He had remained with a relative, an uncle who raised him in Oregon. Walter had grown up believing he was an only child too, until he had taken a DNA test just 6 months earlier, curious about his roots. He'd seen the match to Harold Bennett, but assumed it was a mistake. After all, he was 87. Who finds a brother at that age? Now, they both knew the truth. Emma reached out to Walter's granddaughter, and within a day, the families were exchanging emails, photos, phone calls. It was like watching puzzle pieces fly across time and fall perfectly into place. And when Walter's voice finally came through the phone, crackly, warm and disbelieving, Harold wept. Not a quiet tear, but a full-bodied sob, the kind that comes from a place so deep you almost forget it exists. "I thought I was alone," Harold said. "You never were," Walter replied. The night after the phone call with Walter, he sat in his armchair with a wool blanket over his knees and the DNA report open on the table in front of him. It was surreal, like reading someone else's story and realizing it was your own. His whole life had been lived in black and white, and suddenly color was flooding in. But with the color came questions, so many questions. Who were their parents? What really happened back in 1939 when their family was torn apart? Why had Harold ended up alone, while Walter had grown up knowing the names of his parents, hearing their stories and being held by someone who remembered? Emma, ever resourceful, became the family historian overnight. She dug through online archives, requested documents from New York and Oregon, and interviewed surviving relatives of Walter who were as stunned as everyone else. Bit by bit, the picture came into focus. Their mother's name was Margaret Sinclair, a nurse from Yorkshire who moved to America after marrying a US soldier, Thomas Bennett, during World War I. They had little money, but a lot of hope. Walter was born in 1936, and Harold followed 2 years later in 1938. But in 1939, Disaster struck. A fire broke out in their small home in Albany, New York. No one knew how it started. Margaret suffered burns trying to rescue her children. She survived barely, but was left in critical condition. Thomas was deployed overseas at the time and couldn't return. With no immediate family nearby, social services stepped in. Harold, still a toddler, was taken into temporary care. The paperwork from that time was chaotic and riddled with errors. One tragic administrative mistake changed everything. Harold was listed as an unidentified orphan. No one verified his identity. No one cross-checked his file. He was moved to a different county and placed in the foster system. Within a year, he was adopted by a couple in Syracuse who never told him the truth. Meanwhile, Walter was claimed by an uncle, Thomas's older brother, who took him to Oregon and raised him as his own. Margaret died 2 years later from complications. By the time Thomas returned from the war, the system had already closed the case. He searched for Harold, but every trail went cold. Eventually, grieving and broken, he gave up. He died in 1954, never knowing his youngest son was alive. When Harold read the full story, his hands shook so badly he had to set the papers down. "They didn't abandon me," he said aloud to no one, his voice cracking. All these years, he had lived with a quiet shame, an unspoken feeling that maybe he hadn't been wanted, that maybe there was something wrong with him. But the truth shattered that belief. He had been loved. He had been missed. And through a cruel twist of history and bureaucracy, he had been lost. The emotional weight was unbearable at times. He cried openly, something he hadn't done in years. But the tears weren't just of pain. They were also of relief, of clarity, of healing. Walter sent old photographs through email, pictures of their parents, their mother in a nurse's uniform, their father in military gear, smiling with a cigarette hanging from his lip. In one image, Margaret held a baby. Walter wasn't sure which of them it was. They both studied that photo for hours, searching for clues in the baby's eyes, in the way the tiny hand curled around the mother's finger. For Harold, each photo was like a gift he never knew he needed, proof that he belonged somewhere. They spoke on the phone nearly every day, slowly stitching together the tapestry of a life that had been ripped apart. Walter told stories of their father's sense of humor, how he used to sing loudly and off-key. Harold shared memories of how he'd always loved books and wondered if that came from his mother. They even discovered little quirks they shared. Both hated olives, both whistled when nervous, and both had married women named Lillian. The more they talked, the more they felt like brothers, not just biologically, but in spirit. There was a natural rhythm between them, like old friends picking up where they left off, even though they'd never met. But for Harold, there was still one thing he needed: to see Walter in person. The day began like any other, but for Harold, it felt like the first real day of his life. The air in New York was brisk, tinged with the scent of early autumn leaves. Emma helped him pack his bag. Just a few changes of clothes, his shaving kit, and a small photo album of his children and grandchildren. But the most important thing he carried was invisible: the anticipation, the nerves, and the quiet, thunderous hope that had been building for weeks. At 85 years old, Harold had never flown in a plane. "It's never too late for firsts," Emma said, gently squeezing his hand at the gate. He smiled, but his heart pounded like it might break through his chest. He was going to Oregon, to meet his brother. The flight felt endless. Every cloud out the window looked like a memory waiting to be unlocked. He held a crumpled letter in his hand. Walter had written it days before, unable to wait for the moment. The last line echoed in his mind: "When I see you, I'm hugging our whole childhood at once." When they landed, Emma wheeled him through the terminal in one of those metal airport chairs. Harold's knees weren't what they used to be, and his heart was doing too much at once, racing, remembering, hoping. He spotted the sign before he saw the man holding it, big black letters on white poster board: "Welcome home, brother." Walter stood just behind it. 87 years old, tall and slightly hunched, with eyes that sparkled like he was a boy again. His hands trembled at his sides, but his smile was steady, so full of love it hurt to look at. Harold didn't speak. He couldn't. He stood up slowly, stepped forward, and wrapped his arms around his brother, and then the world stopped. It wasn't a handshake. It wasn't a polite embrace. It was a homecoming. Walter clung to him like someone who'd been underwater for too long and had finally come up for air. They didn't say anything for a full minute. They just held each other, sobbing in a crowded airport as if no one else existed. Strangers around them paused, unsure of what they were witnessing, but sensing it was something sacred. A few even cried. When they finally pulled apart, Harold whispered, "I thought I'd live and die not knowing who I was." Walter touched his shoulder, his voice thick with tears. "You're my brother. That's who you are." That weekend was a blur of shared meals, late-night talks, and long drives through the Oregon countryside. Walter took him to the lake where he fished every summer, showed him the treehouse he built for his own grandkids, and played him the old vinyl records their father had loved. Each moment stitched together what had been torn for a lifetime. They sat by the fire one evening, sipping tea like old men do, and Harold turned to Walter. "Do you ever think about what we missed?" Walter nodded slowly. "All the time. But," he continued, "we also found each other. Before it was too late. That counts for something." Harold stared into the flames. "It counts for everything." They shared stories like kids at a sleepover. Only these stories were precious, irreplaceable, and stitched with decades of longing. Walter gave Harold a photo of their mother that he kept in his wallet since he was a boy. Harold cried when he saw it. "I've never known her face," he said, "and yet it feels like coming home." On the final day of the visit, the two families gathered for a barbecue in Walter's backyard. There were 4 generations present. Children played tag under the trees, while great-grandparents, strangers just a week before, sat side by side laughing over stories they never thought they'd share. Emma raised her glass at sunset. "To Harold and Walter," she said, her voice cracking. "Proof that love is stronger than time and family is never truly lost." The entire backyard echoed with applause and cheers. Harold looked at Walter with misty eyes and whispered, "I didn't just find my brother, I found my beginning." And Walter, his voice low and reverent, replied, "And I found my ending." In the weeks that followed, Harold returned to New York, but something inside him had changed forever. His steps were slower, but lighter. The silence in his home no longer felt like loneliness. It felt like peace. The ache that had lived in his chest for over 8 decades had quieted, replaced by a kind of warmth he hadn't known was possible. He and Walter spoke every day, sometimes for hours. They shared everything, aches and jokes, regrets and memories. No matter how fragmented or fragile, they made plans, not just to visit again, but to celebrate the time they had left. Birthdays, holidays, even just random Tuesdays. For Harold, life felt new. He started writing. Little essays and reflections, pieces of memory he could finally give names to. With Emma's help, he began compiling them into a book. Not for publication, but for the family. For the generations that would come after, so no one would have to wonder where they came from again. "I used to think I didn't have a story," he told Emma one afternoon over tea. "Turns out I was living a novel all along. I just hadn't found the other chapters yet." She smiled, her eyes full of pride. "You're the final chapter of a story that took a lifetime to tell." But it wasn't just about looking back. Harold, at 85, was now building new roots. Walter's children welcomed him as an uncle they never had. His great-nieces and nephews FaceTimed him weekly, sending videos of their soccer games and school recitals. Harold's world expanded, not through travel or wealth, but through connection. For the first time in his life, He felt known. One particular day, Harold received a package in the mail. Inside was a wooden box with a brass plaque that read, "To my brother, from your brother." He opened it slowly, tears welling before he even saw what was inside. It was their father's pocket watch. Walter had kept it since he was a boy, passed down from their uncle, a piece of their family that had survived everything. "He would have wanted you to have it," Walter wrote in a letter tucked inside. "It belonged to both of us, just like the time we lost and the time we still have." Harold held the watch in his hand, listening to its soft tick like a heartbeat. It didn't matter that he had lived so long without this part of his history. What mattered was that he had found it before the clock ran out. He wore it every day after that. Later that year, Harold and Walter reunited again, this time in New York. They visited the cemetery where their mother was buried. For the first time in his life, Harold stood at her grave with flowers in hand and whispered, "I found him, Mom. I found my brother." Walter placed a hand on his shoulder, and they stood in silence as the leaves rustled around them. There were no tears this time, just peace. That evening, back at Harold's house, they sat around the table with both families, laughing, reminiscing, passing dishes like they'd done it for decades. At one point, Emma turned to her grandfather. "What's the biggest lesson you've learned through all of this?" Harold looked around the room, the faces, the joy, the impossible love that had risen from ashes. "That it's never too late," he said, "to ask the hard questions, to open the right doors, to love someone you've never met but always missed." And then, after a beat, he added, "We're all just looking for home. Sometimes home is a person, sometimes it's a voice, and sometimes it's a brother." Walter raised his glass. "To the years we lost and the ones we found." Glasses clinked. Laughter rose, and in the glow of the dining room light, two brothers, once lost, now found, sat side by side as the past healed quietly behind them, and the future opened like a door never truly closed. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved us, please don't leave without telling us. Stories like Harold and Walter's aren't just about DNA. They're about love that stands the test of time, and family that finds its way back home, even after a lifetime apart. If you believe in second chances, unexpected reunions, and the power of truth, like this video, share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. And subscribe to our channel for more true stories that will stay in your heart long after the screen goes dark. Because you never know. The next story could be yours.